I was part of the most elite, well-trained unit in the United States Navy for almost 10 years. It's not the Navy SEALs, my friend, it's the Navy Band. So that first day in the Navy Band, that was a hell of a day. 40-something hours, 8,500 something miles, just getting used to traveling these big distances. And had a hell of a time that first night in Hong Kong. Once again, I was such a dumbass at that age, and there were a few guys that were heavy drinkers in the band. They had all been to college, and I was this idiot from high school, never been to college, and just wasn't used to the real world at that point. So the guys took me out partying, and sure enough, about 2 days later, we did a couple more small gigs, and it was time to pack up and head on to our next destination, which is Subic Bay in the Philippines. So this was a trip I would do countless times over the next few years. The Hong Kong to Philippines was pretty common for us because we had a large military base in the Philippines, the Navy did, and we would stop there to refuel before we went to our other stops and kind of before we went home to Yokosuka, Japan most of the time. So time for the Wayback Machine, folks. This was a pre-digital revolution. So if you can imagine, all our amplifiers were really heavy analog amplifiers. Sometimes we were carrying 5 or 6 amps, plus EQs, plus mixing boards, plus this, plus that. And when you put 2 of these really giant amplifiers into a rack that you carried them with, you're talking 120, maybe 150 pounds. And so that big rack had 4 handles, one on each corner, and the 4 lowest totem pole sailors. That was our job. We would grab those giant racks and carry them around. And even a small gig, moving from one block to the next, you had to pack everything up and move it over. And then when we got to the airport, the Navy would have these giant metal pallets that we had to load all of the equipment onto. So with these giant pallets, you're loading these really, really heavy amps on there. And it had to be in this perfect order. Everything heavy on the bottom, then lighter stuff, and the lightest stuff on the very top of the pyramid. And then you would take a big cargo net, and you had to put the cargo net over everything. Had to be tied down perfectly. And at that point, the air crew would come over. They would inspect it. And if anything was wrong, hey, you have to tear it apart. We want this over here and that over there. So a lot of times we'd have to tear that thing apart on the tarmac as we're waiting on the plane, put it back together. And finally, the air crew would give us a thumbs up, and they would take a forklift and put the big pallet onto the C-130. Yeah, anyone that served much time in the military back in the early 90s and mid-90s definitely will recognize a C-130. That was a workhorse aircraft of the military back then. It could be emptied out on the inside, and you could put a shit ton of cargo in there. Or you could put all these little fold-down strap seats down, and you could put a whole bunch of people in there. So it's a very versatile plane, and I've logged just hundreds and hundreds of thousands of miles on these planes. And one of the most memorable moments for me was flying on a C-130, and as we landed into the Philippines, that had a big back door that opened up. And usually the aircraft crew would open the back door just as we landed, and we were still taxiing down the runway. And then the Philippines is usually very warm and humid. You could feel that hot, humid air like getting sucked into the back of the plane, and just know okay, we're in the Philippines now, So I've done that so many times. It's very memorable. I can almost still smell and feel like that humid air coming into the back of the plane as they open the back up. So you got to remember, this is the early 90s when I started going out to the Philippines. And, at that time, it was such a different country. People were generally pretty poor out there, especially after you get away from the base and the city that's right next to the base, which is Subic Bay. People are still living in little tin shacks, and maybe some people not even having a tin shack, maybe not even having $1 to their name. It's very eye-opening, and coming from a little bitty town in Texas, I was just so naive to the rest of the world. Never really studied much in the way of world geography or anything. So traveling around started to open my eyes of, there's the whole different world out here. People are in different circumstances. So, we walked off the base into Subic Bay. And way back then, it could be a kind of a dangerous place. A lot of stuff going on, a lot of shady people hanging out outside of military bases. There's a lot of young guys with a whole bunch of cash in their hand, So get out of the base, there's bars. And, the guys in the band were amazing. Both Scott Davenport and I mentioned earlier, John Sorensen. These guys were just like really honest, amazing Midwest guys from Wisconsin. And they really looked out for me. And they could see probably right away I was a bit of a party maniac. I like to go drinking and getting out of control. And, when we walked off the base, they both told me, hey, Hank, keep your shit in check. We're going to be walking out here. There's a lot of shit that could go wrong. Tonight, you got to stay by us. No exceptions, no going off. Stay by our side. We're going to, drink all night and we'll get you back onto the base before curfew. So at that time, I think midnight was a curfew. And, we just went out and went absolutely crazy, at least on my part, just drinking like a maniac. It was so cheap to drink back there and eat in that time. And we saw a live band. They were incredible. They were doing one of the hits by AC/DC at that time was one of the songs. And the other one was Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody. And although they didn't speak English, they sang the frickin' song just like the album. It was incredible. And so it was my first kind of time out just in the Philippines, partying, had a hell of a time. And because Scott and John were looking out for me, I got so outrageously drunk, and they dragged me back to the barracks that night. And we made it back onto the base for our gig the next day at Mayor Gordon's house. So Dick Gordon was the mayor of Olongapo City, which was the city right outside of Subic Bay Naval Base in the Philippines there. And he was probably the first real diplomat I met, and just, great guy, real nice. He loved the band. And every time we had come down to the Philippines, we'd meet Mayor Gordon at a mall opening or a new post office, or, he was a mayor, so he did a lot of publicity. And we would go and play big band music for him, a lot of times at private parties at his residence or someone's house there just outside of town. Yeah, and back in that time, we were flying to the Philippines all the time. We'd fly there, refuel, and then fly off somewhere else in the Pacific. So we got to know that Subic Bay area really well. They had a nice marina there. My dad had taught me to sail as a young kid, so I would go rent a boat. We would sail around the guys, get a bunch of beers, and sail around the island and hang out at the beach. It's, just really beautiful tropical area. And at that time, Mayor Gordon, every time we landed, he would be calling us, hey, guys, I got a gig for you here or there. And, we'd go out. He'd have the most incredible spreads. I'm talking like the best Filipino food you could ever imagine, and just massive quantities. He'd have a whole bunch of beer and open bar for us. So just an amazing diplomat. He really knew how to grease the wheels, and, was a good go-between between the Navy and the Filipino people there. And, so I was in the Philippines there and had done the Hong Kong gig. I felt like I was really becoming a part of the band, and part of the tradition with the 7th Fleet Band was that once you've done a couple of gigs with the band and you go to the Philippines, the guys take you to the seamstress and they make you a custom Navy band hat. So everyone in the band wore these ball caps, and you got them made in the Philippines in Subic Bay there. And the rest of my naval career, I would have 7th Fleet Band, and I eventually went out to the 6th Fleet Band. So wherever I went, I had the ball cap for that. And when you went on a Navy ship, everyone wore a ball cap with what they did. And then, of course, we walked around with the Navy band on our ball caps with a music lyre. And, that was it. We finished the gigs there. I flew back to Japan. And the next series, I'll talk a little bit about getting Japan and walking around outside the base. It was pretty awesome. I mean, altogether, just so distant from where I grew up, but amazing time. Thank you to my dad for recommending me to go overseas as my first duty station. And folks, thanks for listening so much. I really appreciate it. Hope y'all have a great day. Fair winds and following seas.